Hi everyone, this is Dave from Dave the SEO & Co. And I'm going to be going through my talk from last week at the time of recording, from the Green SEO meetup at Brighton SEO in Brighton. I did a quick talk last week about if you've got an upcoming website migration, how to do it sustainably. I had more content than I had time, unfortunately. And so I wanted to do a recording for everybody who couldn't make it, but also to go into a little bit more detail. So here we go. And for anyone who's watching who's not doing a migration right now, there's still some interesting stuff in here, still some useful stuff in here, I think, for improving the sustainability of your site, a lot of which also impacts the speed of your site. But the reality is there's always going to be limitations if you're working on a site where this has not been baked in from the beginning. So migrations really are your one true shot to make your site sustainable now and for the future, making sure you're future-proofing it as well, whatever the future of the web may hold. And if your stakeholders are still not convinced, then you can also save money and speed things up, which will of course also can improve conversions. So let's start off by talking about what we're not talking about here when we're talking about doing a website migration in a sustainable way. We don't mean recycling your old site or bits of your old site. If your site is not fit for purpose, the best thing to do, chuck it away, start again afresh. And we're going to make that new site as sustainable as we can. So let's talk a bit generally about sustainable web design first. But first, a celebration. I'll point out that I'm not being hypocritical and including loads and loads of AI images in this talk, because of course they do take energy to produce. One of the last slides I did make, I admit, but this one, it comes from Sora. So a sustainability tip not directly related to this is go to Sora and you can search for images that other people have generated in the past. And there's a very high chance that there'll be something there that meets your needs, as is the case with this image here. So that's going to improve sustainability as well. Right, as I say, a celebration. So web sustainability guidelines have been released by W3C, who are the people behind, well, the people behind the standards of the web. Not just anybody producing these, and these are very detailed. A lot of things I'm going to talk about are covered in more detail, more technical detail within this document. At the same time, I'm not going to be referring to these standards directly because they only came out fairly recently and I didn't have time to really change my presentation around to refer to them directly. But they are the framework we need to be more sustainable and also to communicate with developers. So if we're working on a new site alongside developers a lot of the time, the technical details from these web sustainability guidelines are going to be the perfect thing to send along to the developers we're working with. So, unfortunately, the web, tools that run on the web, sites that run on the web are getting more energy hungry. It's very easy to feel like we can't really influence this because with the amount of energy being used for things like AI, anything we do is a drop in the ocean. But I disagree. There's still a huge amount of opportunity to cut down on the amount of energy we use, but also think about where that energy comes from, because it's not such a big issue to use a lot of energy for things like using AI if the data centers that those are being running on are green, are sustainable, are using renewable energy. But it's not just about electricity, and it's not just about carbon footprint when we're talking about sustainability. Data centers, whether they're being used for hosting websites, whatever they're being used for, they use a lot of water, and often they are located in areas with water deprivation, and they take water away from people who need it more, from farmers, from local population, and also potentially pollute water as well. We also need to consider the rare earth minerals, the resources that are being used for things like making batteries, making servers and other hardware. And at the end of the day, what we really care about is the environmental and human cost of that. And so it could be that we're working with a data center that's located in the United States, for example, but that can still have an impact on people living in places like, in this example here from the screenshot, China, but anywhere else in the world as well. Now, when you come to migrate, the first thing you have to choose is which platform you're going to work with. And most platforms and CMSs can be sustainable, but they can also be an absolute disaster. It really depends on how the site is set up and built in most cases. There are some platforms that are intrinsically bad, and those tend to be the ones where you don't have very much flexibility, where you maybe have website builders where you're not able to add extra settings or cut down the code and do some of the things that we're going to talk about today. And there are some that are particularly good, and those tend to be the ones that are at the other end of the spectrum, which are very flexible, but also maybe platforms that have a lot of third-party support and third-party add-ons, or have a community where you can find out from other people how they've done some of the things you want to do on that platform. So more obscure platforms, maybe that's going to be more difficult to get that information. However, a well-designed site that's on bad hosting could be worse for the environment, for sustainability, than a bad site that's been put on eco-friendly hosting, which is maybe using lots of energy, wasting lots of energy, but at least that energy is renewable, for example. And don't assume that big hosting companies are necessarily bad. They have a lot more scrutiny, and sometimes that pushes them to do the right thing. I mean, some of them maybe want to do the right thing, but at the end of the day, it's also in their interests to save electricity. And don't assume that even small green hosting companies are necessarily good. Check the hosting companies. I'm not going to call any out right now, but there are some hosting companies who claim to be green and have great green credentials, who, when you really look into it, are not. So we're going to talk about some of the things to look out for in a minute. Before we go into the actual what you need to do to be sustainable, it's, I think, useful to understand what impacts usage of energy and other resources. So one that often gets forgotten is transmission, actually sending data backwards and forwards. That uses electricity to send that data. Data storage uses up electricity, but also uses up hardware and also batteries for backup power. And then processing, regardless of whether it's being done on the user's computer or being done server side, that uses up electricity, uses up hardware, and potentially also uses water that's used for cooling, particularly when a lot of processing is being done. But we can impact all of these. So transmission, be aware the energy usage is going to be impacted by how much you send, how far you send it, and also how you send it. You can send data halfway around the world and then just the last 100 yards by 5G, and probably that last 100 yards is going to use up more energy, for example. The number of connections as well are going to have an impact. So an extra kilobyte for every connection, and the caching settings you use. And by that I mean edge caching, so use of content delivery networks, but also caching on users' machines of what is the cache control set to 4 different files in terms of how long does it last before it has to be downloaded again. That can make a massive difference to how many files have to be transmitted. Data storage. Obviously, the more you store, the more space you're going to use. But that's regardless of how frequently that data is used. You can have files that aren't in use. You can have images that aren't visible on any actual pages anymore, but are still being stored. And the number of places that files are stored is going to obviously have an impact as well if you're using things like a server network. That doesn't mean that content delivery networks, though, are bad. They are built to be efficient, and we're going to look at those a little bit more in a minute, and why they are such a good idea, and why, if your site isn't already on a content delivery network, it really should be. And as for processing, so if you've got a site that needs lots of rendering each time the page is created, basically, or there's a lot of interactivity on the pages, is going to need more processing. Client side v server side, so generally server side is going to be more efficient, and also mean there's less data that needs to be transmitted. The number of database requests is going to have an impact as well. Every time you have to do a database request, that takes energy, that takes processing, and a lot of the time those database requests aren't doing anything useful. And so when it comes to caching, and this is a different type of caching again, so when it comes to caching, if you're able to cache a version of a page that is ready to go, doesn't need additional database requests every time, or if you've got even elements of pages, parts of pages that are already ready to go and cached, you can really cut down on processing time rather than having to produce those elements ready to send every time somebody requests a page. So particularly if you're using green hosting, but in general server-side rendering is more efficient and cuts transmission requests. So content delivery networks or edge caching. So edge caching is keeping the files where they're needed, basically, and it's designed to be as efficient as possible. So only the files that get used locally are stored on each server. Now this map here is very simplified. For a start, America's missing, and Antarctica for that matter. And in the reality is you'd have more servers within your content delivery network. But just to get the idea across, you will have your main server, shown there in black, with all of your files on, everything that your site may ever possibly need is stored there, but the files that get used most often are stored closer to where they are being used. So if you have lots of people using your site in Europe, then your CDN in Europe is going to have more files. But of course, none of the files that never get used, just the ones that get used regularly. If you've got very few users in Africa, for example, then you'll have very few files stored there. And it will be adjusted accordingly around the world. So the cache reflects the demand, and this minimizes the transmission costs. So even though you've got multiple versions, and so as I said, that's going to increase energy and hardware usage for that storage. But if it's been run in an efficient way, which the CDNs are set to do, your transmission costs get minimized, and overall you're going to be more efficient. Definitely more efficient than a server network. So before CDNs came along, some companies would have networks of servers around the world to try and speed things up for their local users, and every server would have every file on, which is incredibly wasteful way of doing things. This is a more efficient version of that. So hosting, things to look out for could be big hosting companies, could be small hosting companies, but look out for hosting companies using another service for their data center. So hosting companies that are based within AWS, for example. That doesn't mean they're necessarily bad, but it means you need to look at the credentials of Amazon Web Services data centers, not just at the hosting company themselves. Maybe the green credentials just don't stack up though. Have they got recycling commitments? Are they worth the paper they're printed on? Water commitments, not just water usage, but avoiding pollution, not using groundwater. How are they going to deal with water stress in certain areas? What they're going to do at certain times of year, for example. Where are their data centers located? Are they on brownfield sites? Are they being put on greenfield sites? Are they in urban locations v rural locations? And also the climate of the data center location. So if you put a data center in, let's say, Phoenix, Arizona, it's very hot, so you need to use a lot of water for cooling, but at the same time, there's not that much water around in the desert in Arizona. And are the companies doing, do they have schemes like reusing the heat that's being produced? Further ways to check that the credentials really stack up is to make sure you understand whether they are really using renewables or whether they are buying certificates that are available from renewable energy companies. And the difference is about additionality. So look out for companies that use RECs or GOs, renewable energy certificates or guarantees of origin, who maybe say that they are green and use renewable energy, but this isn't quite the same as using renewable energy. This is basically buying certificates, which if an energy producer in the US for the RECs and in Europe for the GOs, if an energy producer is producing a renewable energy, they are then, once they're producing that energy, allowed to sell certificates. So they're producing the energy anyway, is the argument. Therefore, they're not creating additionality. So the hosting companies aren't creating additionality by requiring more renewable energy to be produced. Things that are better to look out for are things like power purchase agreements or similar things where companies are directly buying renewable energy and increasing demand for renewable energy, although those power purchase agreements are more difficult for smaller companies. What's better if there's companies who are using their own renewable energy for generation, and of course that's more likely with bigger companies and bigger data centers. So I'd say the availability of truly green hosting, like the best of the best green renewable hosting, has been slow to become available, particularly for small companies. There are some small startup hosting companies doing interesting things, such as Deep Green Energy there and some other similar ones, startups in the UK and other countries who are reusing waste heat. In some cases, that might be to heat up swimming pools. In other cases, it's things like community energy projects. So the waste heat that's produced is not being wasted. So that's also great to see. But ideally, yeah, of course, they were using the renewable energy in the first place. One place you can start your search is this link here on this slide, greenweb.org, their directory of green hosting companies. But check those hosting companies in more detail. There are some hosting companies in there who are very green, and there are some who are quite green, and some who, my personal opinion is that it's really greenwashing, and they're not that green at all. You'll see what the evidence that they've presented that they're green is within that directory. So it's quite easy to go in and check and see what they're actually doing to be green. But like I say, it's a lot easier for bigger data centers to be built to be sustainable. So really good data centers include Switch and Iron Mountain. Very modern, very efficient. Switch have their own renewables and they replenish the water they use, double the water they use. Iron Mountain have their own solar generation, very efficient data centers. But you can't work with them directly if you're a small company, unfortunately. If you're a big enterprise company, you could use a co-location service where you literally go and put your hardware, your hosting into their data centers. Otherwise, though, you need to work with somebody who's working with them. So Rackspace do manage hosting with Switch, so they're a good option. Greenhost, which are a Dutch hosting company, work with Iron Mountain, so they are one that are definitely worth looking into, although they don't offer a CDN. So your CDN you might need to then get separately through something like AWS's CloudFront. Which brings me on to Amazon Web Services. So they genuinely do have programs where they are building renewable energy. They have a lot of projects to build hydro, to build wind, etc., to power their data centers, particularly a lot of projects in India where there's a lot of data centers being built, and also in Europe. However, right now they do use those renewable energy certificates, and there's a lot of lack of transparency about their claims about use of renewable energy and where it's actually coming from at the moment. But they are, building projects, so they're looking to change that. So they're definitely not the worst, but there's pros and cons there. And you can work with them directly through their CloudFront offering, for example. But then there's also a lot of different hosting companies who work through them. So we talked a lot about hosting. So let's move on to if you're migrating to a new platform, migrating to a brand new site, things you can be looking at, working with your devs on to improve. Now, some of these are things that you can fix later on as well. When I initially did this talk, I focused on things you can only really do properly when you're working on migrations. I've now got some additional slides in here. So, browser caching. Check your cache control and look at your files and see how often they really need to be re-downloaded. Some of these are not going to need to be re-downloaded at all, but things like images, fonts, CSS, etc., it can be 30 days or more that you can go without them having to be updated, depending on exactly how often you're updating things on your website. And things like images and fonts potentially never need to expire, because if the files are being updated, they've probably got new file names. So the scripts are going to call the new versions of those files when that gets updated. So they don't necessarily need to then expire at all. So this really cuts down on those transmission by not having to re-download files every single time, and you'd be surprised how many sites there are with images with maybe the cache control set super low. So if it's more than 30 minutes, for example, the image is re-downloaded. Another easy to fix area, maybe not quite as easy as the one before, but still fairly easy, is looking at unused code and looking at legacy code. And this is one that probably is easiest to do when you're migrating, because you should only be moving across code that's really useful. So particularly if you're staying with the same platform, but maybe you're redesigning other elements such as your templates, make sure you're not moving across all the code for your old templates, which maybe not going to be used anymore, and keeping that in your main JavaScript or your main CSS files. Look out for features that maybe get developed when the site's being worked on, but they never get rolled out or they are restarted. So any excess unused code, look out for. And you can check this in staging, of course, using DevTools and using the coverage options there to see what percentage of files are being used. And the best way to do that is to actually make sure you're interacting with the page, viewing it in desktop and mobile, because sometimes those percentages will change when you interact with the page. And you're maybe not going to be able to identify exactly which code is and isn't being used, but you can talk to the developers about it. And if there's a lot of unused code, the issue might be with compiling. And this is something that will get worse as time goes on once the site is launched. So ideally you want to spot it before. So every time new pages get added, new code gets added, then the JavaScript, the CSS is going to be recompiled and additional code is added. But what often happens is that any old code, any unused code isn't being removed. So say you change a template and you stop using some styles and use some new styles. Those new styles get added to your CSS file, but are the old ones being removed? They should be. And maybe there's some code that's only used on a few pages or very specific pages. For example, if you've got checkout, it's probably a lot of code that makes the checkout work. Is that code within your main JavaScript file, for example? Is that getting downloaded on every single page? Because it's going to slow down when the user first comes to your website, which isn't great, because at the point when at the checkout it doesn't matter quite so much. And it's also going to waste a lot of energy on transmission, and potentially also waste energy when it comes to actually processing those files if things are being processed which aren't actually making any impact on what's happening on the page. Make sure you're sending the right image sizes. Make sure they're getting resized for viewport. So using tools like Akamai. If you use Akamai as your CDN, it will resize images to a suitable resolution for thumbnails. And with your fonts, try and use standard system fonts, which don't need to be downloaded each time. They're built into what the browser has available to it. And if you are going to use web fonts, font files that have to be downloaded every time, try and minimize it to 1 to 2 fonts for the entire site. Don't have loads of different fonts on every single page, so every time a user goes to a new page, they're having to download new font files. Look out when you're in staging and when you're looking at what's actually being downloaded. Look out for image files that are design elements, and think about whether those designs, the style of the page could be achieved with CSS, a few lines of code, instead of downloading an entire image. So look out for things like corners and lines and things. You want to cut unnecessary crawling. So make sure you've got your duplicate content handled. Make sure you've got canonicals in place. Obviously, stuff you should be doing for SEO anyway. But also, if you've got all these extra URLs that are having to be crawled, even if crawl budget isn't an issue for you on your site, it's still files that are having to be downloaded. And it's estimated that some websites, as much as 50% of traffic, is just crawlers. So you can help save a lot by handling your duplicate content properly. And also look out for spider traps. So things like indexable facets, things like parameters, so that can produce almost infinite numbers of pages that some crawlers might try and crawl, try and access, try and work out what they are, and lead to, again, a lot of extra transmission of pages that have no value. One that's definitely a good one to get done, ideally as a spec before you get to the point where you're in staging, is to make sure that all files are transmitted via HTTP2 or better still HTTP3 protocol, and you shouldn't be using HTTP 1.1 for anything anymore. So these are the protocols that control how connections are established and how files are sent backwards and forwards. HTTP2 has been around for a long time now, and that main improvement there was being able to handle multiple requests within one connection, and that made it 30% faster than 1.1. But HTTP3 now is available, but it's not really being picked up as quickly as it should. maybe because when it first came out, it didn't really seem to have that much improvement, but it's been improved further now, I think, and estimates now that it's 10 to 20% faster again than HTTP 2. And look out for third-party resources that are still on HTTP 1.1. Compression, so use modern image formats. Again, if you use something like Akamai and other kind of image management tools, they can automatically put them into WebP format, which saves about 25 to 30% file size compared to JPEGs. Text files, it might seem like they're pretty small to begin with, but when you consider how many there are, how many times they're getting sent, if you can compress them and save up to 70% of the file size, that's going to make a big impact overall as well. Keep an eye on your third-party scripts. Don't just migrate stuff from your old site to your new site without asking what it is, what it's doing, how you're actually going to use it. Look out for things like social scripts, heat maps, A/B testing, and work out what's actually being used. I've seen sites in the past that have maybe got, 3 or 4 different heat map tools, none of which are actually being used. It slows everything down, it bloats everything, there's lots of extra files that need to be stored and need to be sent. And use Google Tag Manager for third-party scripts where you can. It's much easier for you to then manage them. So if you do want to do some A/B testing, you don't have to go to your developers to then switch off the third-party scripts from actually being fired and actually sending. You should be able to go into Google Tag Manager yourself and switch those off. You can also set conditional firing. So if you're only running A/B testing on a few pages, you're not sending those scripts and running those scripts on every single page. It can also make sure that things don't get sent, data doesn't get captured before permission's been given for cookies, for example, and it can also enable synchronous loading as well. So there's different types of delayed loading for files, which can mean they don't have to be downloaded or they don't have to be processed. If you use lazy loading, it prioritizes what's above the fold, but it also is based on how far down the page somebody scrolls. Now, here it's sort of a choice between balancing performance v energy, because if somebody scrolls down the page very quickly, it might be that they come to an element that hasn't loaded yet. But you can have it set that once people get within a percentage of the position of an element on the page, at that point it starts downloading. And that means that if people come to a page just to click on something at the top of the page or just to navigate, they don't have to have the stuff that's further down the page downloaded or don't have to have it processed. You can also set certain elements to only load up once people click on them. So for example, if you've got lots of YouTube videos, maybe you've got a page with a dozen different YouTube videos and most people are just going to look at 1 or 2 of them. Or have it set so you've got a thumbnail with a play sign on it, and when somebody clicks that, then the applet actually downloads and processes and loads, and that can make a big saving as well. Try and consolidate the elements on your site, consolidate the templates you have. Again, this is going back to the early stages of the planning for your migration. Try and plan to have a small number of templates that are built to be flexible rather than lots of different templates with lots of different elements on them. And within the templates, try and reuse the same elements, the same files that need to be downloaded, the same code. And also look out for scripts, things like audio players. If you have audio on certain pages of your site, for example, then make sure you're using the same script, the same audio player on all the pages rather than using different ones all the time. And then we move on to some of the very technical, more technical things to be worked on more in the back end. Again, if these can be baked in from the beginning when you're working with the developers to plan the spec for the site, it's going to be a lot easier. and it's really the developers who are going to need to actually work on this. But hopefully this gives you ideas of things that you can suggest. Database requests. So database requests, don't automatically do them. Make sure the site's designed so that database requests are only being done when they actually impact something on the page. Look out for third-party tools as well that make lots of database requests when they aren't actually needed. Try and set up the site so that you can have pages, so you can have objects cached so they are on the server ready to be sent. At the very least, have a version for cookieless users, which will include Googlebot Smartphone. That's ready to serve. And ideally for anybody who doesn't have anything in their cookies, that indicates they need a personalized version of the page. So that may well get to quite a high percentage of your users, depending on your exact site. And again, if we think about how much traffic is coming from crawlers, it's coming from likes of Googlebot Smartphone. If we can send them a version of the page which doesn't need to be re-rendered, that doesn't need any additional database requests, massive savings there as well. And like I say, it doesn't have to necessarily be the entire page. If you do need to have interactivity on your page, you can at least have some elements of the page which are ready to serve, which don't change very often. Tools like pre-render can be a way to add this in, certainly for a site that's already been developed or already partway through development, or where it's just not something that's built into the way the platform works. So pre-render is able to basically do a server-side rendered version of the site, have it cached, have it ready to serve in specific circumstances, such as to all cookieless users. And so you don't need to re-render the page every single time, and that can make massive savings there. I would guess around 60% of traffic is cookieless and can be served to cache page. So maybe about, if we take it as 40% of bot traffic is your traffic, and then a further 20% is uncookied, real human users, but without cookies enabled. That's 60%. And if you can add on to that those who don't need anything changed on the page, anything personalized, then that percentage increases even higher. Polling v pushing. So services that use push notifications, such as WebSockets, are going to be more efficient. So basically the server sending a message telling the front end that it needs to update, rather than having polling where the browser, the front end, basically has to keep on checking to see if anything has changed, is going to be more efficient. Use server-side rendering where possible. As mentioned, it's more efficient in the first place, but it also means that a lot less is going to need to be transferred. So rather than sending your HTML file and then sending your JavaScript files, your CSS files, and so on, if you have a HTML file that's already got all the code for the browser to know exactly how to show the page, that's going to use a lot less processing and mean less files get sent. If you need to have interactivity, which is where client-side rendering can work well, you can still have that for elements of the page where needed. And that leads on nicely to potentially using headless. Headless isn't for everyone. You need to have developers who are experienced at using headless, particularly if you get onto more complicated things like headless e-commerce sites, but it is possible. And what headless does is it decouples the front end and the back end of the website, so they can be built separately. And if we look at a simple content site, you can have a headless site that uses a static site generator, where it basically pulls the content for each page from an API. So that might get sent as a simple JSON file, for example, and the front end then is able to generate cacheable HTML versions of each page to send as well, so it doesn't necessarily need to contact the API every time. So you don't have scripts, you don't have CSS. It really cuts things down. It cuts down what's stored on the server as well as what's transmitted, and it also cuts down on processing, so it really helps out with those 3 areas of energy and resource usage. But even if you've got a highly interactive site with lots of scripts running, review what scripts are running and try and break up long scripts. So that might seem like, well, it's not really going to make any savings. It just changes what's running when. But actually, a lot of people come to a web page and navigate away straight away. They go to a different page. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It might be they come into a landing page and they can straight away see that's where I actually need to go to next. I'm going to click on here. If you have long scripts that are running, particularly after the page is rendered and is visible, they're going to have the frustration of clicking on something and nothing happens potentially. So high interaction to next paint because there's a long task running in the background and slowing things down. If they can move before everything runs, that also cuts down the energy cost because those scripts never need to run. Likewise, if you defer non-critical JavaScript, so if a user comes to the page and navigates away straight away, you've got JavaScript that again never needs to run if it's only needed for the interactivity on the page that not all users are going to interact with. Look out for scripts that constantly loop when they're not actually doing anything useful. So that means there's basically processing, there's stuff happening on that main thread all the time. So you can see this in DevTools in that performance view where you've constantly got things happening on the main thread, even when nothing's happening on the page and no one's interacting with it and nothing's changing. So that can be a sign that you've got an issue there. And try and work with your developers to develop web pages that have a lower DOM size. Don't have too many elements, don't have excessive numbers of nodes that don't actually impact what shows on the page. Obviously, some pages, some sites are going to have more than others. So it's not like this is too many and this is, enough. But, have you got any that aren't useful? Now, when it comes to measuring your site, so hopefully, if you work with your developers, they've come up with a site, it's in staging, you want to check whether it is as efficient as you hoped it would be. First thing you need to do is make sure that the hosting you're using for your staging is matching what's going to be your live version of the hosting, if you're going to get accurate results for this. And once you have estimates, you can use your annual traffic estimates to try and get an idea of the annual CO2 usage of this. As we say though, it's not just about energy, it's not just about CO2, but this is the easiest thing to measure and a good guideline of how sustainable your site might be. Screaming Frog is one of the best tools, one of the tools that a lot of you already have access to, that allows you to look on a URL level, including on the page level and for the individual resources, to try and identify where you've potentially got an issue. Very quick run through of how to use this, because a lot of people use Screaming Frog and maybe don't know that these options are available. So you've got to have JavaScript rendering enabled. Under Spider Advanced, there's a tick box if you're using green hosting, so it'll then calculate the carbon based on you using renewables. You need to then run your complete crawl. Obviously, you can do it for a list crawl, you can do it for a proper spider crawl. And then it's the validation tab you then need to go to. And on that validation tab, from the top menu of tabs, you can see your overall carbon rating and CO2 in milligrams as well. As I say, for the page overall, so in this screenshot here, that's the top line with IKEA, IKEA's page there, but then also for the individual resources. But at the same time, don't forget storage, because you can have very efficient pages and maybe you've got stuff on your servers though that's taking up a lot of space, which doesn't need to be there. Make sure you are deleting or archiving all the files from your legacy site. Don't just leave them there to rot. And to finish off, a few recommended add-ons and tools you might want to think about. So Akamai mentioned, so that's a CDN, but it has an image and video manager built in. It's got lazy loading built in, so that's a good option for that. Minifies. It removes the blank spaces from JavaScript and CSS, which can have a surprising impact on the size of those files. There's a WordPress available, WordPress, Shopify, and other plugins available. Lazy loading, if you want to do that, you can code it manually. In some cases, your hosting or CDN dashboard will have options for that, and there are plugins that either specifically do that or have lazy loading as an option. Talking of which, WordPress Rocket, if you've got a WordPress site, WordPress Rocket is all focused on speed, really. But pretty much all the things that you can do to improve speed will also improve sustainability. So you've got your caching settings in there, your lazy loading, removing unused CSS, setting your image formats, and much more. Key thing in your toolkit is DevTools. We've seen lots of screenshots from DevTools in Chrome. You've got Google Lighthouse in there to give you tips on where you're wasting megabytes of transmission, for example. You've got that coverage tool I mentioned. You've got network to see what's actually being downloaded, how big are files, what's the cache control on them, and then performance to see all the main thread work, see what's slowing things down and what's taking a long time to run. Database optimizers, so if you want to improve your database usage, cut down on database requests through things like caching, there are add-ons available for various platforms such as WordPress, Drupal, and others. And pre-render, I mentioned, pre-render's got a lot of advantages for SEO. It can also be used for AI accessibility, but it's basically allows you to set up server-side rendering in a very quick and easy way. And you can use that then for things like providing a cached version of the page, providing kind of flat simplified versions of the page for certain user agents, for example. Thank you very much for listening. And if you've got any questions for me, do let me know. If you've got any additional suggestions, do let me know, do comment. This is definitely not everything you can possibly do, but hopefully this has given you some idea and got across the message that when you're migrating, it really is the opportunity to make your site sustainable. Thank you.